Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're venturing into the really intricate and often shadowy world of the Inter-Services Intelligence, Pakistan's ISI. You asked about understanding the powerful forces shaping global events, and, well, few organizations wield quite as much influence in their region as the ISI does.
Exactly. And we'll be drawing on a pretty detailed analysis that looks at the full spectrum, really, from its very creation and how it's transformed over the decades to its core responsibilities, both inside and outside Pakistan, its position on the world stage, the, numerous controversies surrounding its actions, and its significant impact on Pakistan's national direction.
Right, and our goal here is to cut through all that complexity and deliver the crucial insights about the ISI that you're looking for. We want to understand its roots, the immense power it holds within Pakistan, and the often murky controversies it's been embroiled in without overwhelming you. We're aiming for those moments where things just click into place, and you see the bigger picture. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. What were the circumstances that led to the ISI's formation?
Well, the creation of the ISI was really a direct consequence of the First Indo-Pakistani War back in 1947-1948. Our analysis really highlights how that conflict, the one over Kashmir, immediately exposed some critical failures in Pakistan's existing intelligence setup. The Civilian Intelligence Bureau, the IB, it simply couldn't provide the military with the timely and accurate information it needed.
So a moment of crisis really triggered its birth. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But why build an entirely new organization? Why not just, reform the existing one?
That's a really key point. The sources suggest there was a clear preference right from the start for an intelligence agency that was much more, let's say, in tune with the military's perspective and its operational demands. The initial concept actually came from a British Indian Army officer, and the organization itself was built pretty much from scratch by a brigadier general. This military DNA, it really shaped its priorities, making sure it viewed the world primarily through the Pakistan Army's lens. And like you said, the immediate trigger, that Kashmir conflict, firmly established an India-centric focus right from day one.
And in those early years, what were the main factors shaping how the ISI developed?
Pakistan's leadership back then perceived very real, very immediate threats to the nation's existence. This sense of vulnerability, it significantly fueled the ISI's sense of mission and maybe even laid the groundwork for the, considerable autonomy it would later acquire.
Okay, so what was the initial job description? What were they officially supposed to be doing?
Officially, its mandate was to gather external military and non-military intelligence. But that seemingly small non-military part, that proved incredibly significant for its future involvement in domestic affairs.
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd think an organization named Inter-Services and born out of a military fight would be solely focused on, external threats.
Well, what's fascinating here, and the analysis really brings this out, is that for its first 3 decades or so, the ISI actually dedicated more of its resources and attention to internal intelligence. The thinking was this was driven by perceived domestic vulnerabilities, things like ethnic tensions, political dissent, sectarian issues. These were seen as major risks to the stability of the new nation.
That is an unexpected turn. So when did that external focus really start to take hold?
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, that was the absolute pivotal moment. That single event just dramatically reshaped the ISI's role. It became completely central to a major Cold War proxy conflict, acting as the main channel for CIA support to the Afghan Mujahideen. And this naturally led to a huge increase in its resources, its influence, and a much, much stronger emphasis on external operations.
So Afghanistan was a real turning point then. It sort of solidified the ISI's modern form in many ways.
Precisely. It gained invaluable experience, built extensive networks, and really cemented its position of power within the state structure during that whole period. But while it was heavily engaged externally, its domestic reach was also becoming more formalized around that time, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. Around 1975, apparently a dedicated internal wing was actually set up by a civilian prime minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And the irony here is that he reportedly did it because he didn't trust certain officers within the civilian IB.
That's such a critical point. You have a civilian leader trying to address a specific internal security concern who inadvertently paves the way for even greater political interference down the line. It essentially created an official framework for the ISI's domestic surveillance and intervention.
So the seeds of that whole state within a state idea were really sown way back then, the crisis-driven formation, the early military backing, and then boom, this formal internal mandate.
Exactly. It was this sort of confluence of factors that laid the groundwork for the ISI's reputation for significant autonomy and its capacity to operate often beyond typical governmental oversight. So, okay, now we have a sense of its origins. What are its primary responsibilities and goals today?
Officially, the ISI is tasked with gathering global information that's relevant to Pakistan's national security. Their motto, take your precautions, kind of reflects that role as a guardian.
But, as we've already kind of touched on, there's a pretty notable difference between that stated purpose and how it's widely perceived to actually function. It's often seen as operating well beyond that formal remit, primarily aligning itself with the military's strategic objectives.
Which brings us back to that recurring description, a state within a state. It suggests an almost independent power center.
And that perception is definitely reinforced by its deep involvement with groups in Afghanistan and various anti-India militant organizations. This is often viewed as a way to advance Pakistan's security interests in the region, frequently operating outside direct governmental control. One source we looked at even stated flat out that the ISI is owned by the army chief, not the prime minister, which really highlights the military's dominant influence.
And what are some of the core strategic concepts that seem to guide their operations?
Two key doctrines really stand out in the analysis. Strategic depth in Afghanistan. You can think of that as the idea of having a friendly or at least compliant government in Kabul to provide a security buffer, almost like a geopolitical insurance policy against India and the use of unconventional warfare, which basically means supporting militant proxies against India to achieve strategic aims without, direct military engagement.
Yeah, that good versus bad jihadi paradox just keeps popping up. Supporting certain militant groups for strategic goals, while, at the same time, opposing others that attack the Pakistani state itself. It sounds like a strategy just fraught with risk.
Oh, it absolutely is. This approach has generated massive international mistrust and what's commonly known as blowback, where these supported groups can turn against their former patrons or destabilize the region in completely unforeseen and detrimental ways.
So their operational focus externally is mainly India and Afghanistan. But what about inside Pakistan's borders?
Internally, they maintain what the analysis calls a formidable domestic security role. And this includes surveillance of politicians, the media, and the suppression of dissent that's perceived as a threat to national security. The analysis points out how the lines between internal and external security threats are often deliberately blurred, which gives the ISI a very, very broad operational latitude within the country.
Okay, so we've got a clearer picture of their mandate and objectives. How does the ISI actually fit into Pakistan's wider security and military structure? Who's ultimately in charge?
Formally, the head of the ISI is the Director General, or DG ISI, who's a three-star Army general appointed by the Prime Minister. However, and this is crucial, this appointment is made in consultation with the Chief of Army Staff, the COS, who, as we've discussed, wields considerable, arguably decisive influence. The DGISI also chairs the National Intelligence Coordination Committee, or NICC, which puts the ISI right at the heart of Pakistan's intelligence network.
And how does this command structure impact their role in shaping foreign policy?
The ISI plays a very significant role in implementing foreign policy objectives, often with a substantial degree of autonomy. This can lead, and often does lead, to a foreign policy approach that's heavily influenced by military considerations, particularly when it comes to India and Afghanistan. In those areas, security concerns tend to take precedence over, say, diplomatic initiatives or economic cooperation.
Let's delve a bit deeper into their domestic footprint now. We've touched on it, but what's the real extent of their involvement in Pakistan's governance?
Well, the ISI has a long, long history of involvement in governance, and this spans both military rule and periods of civilian administration. This includes things like influencing politicians, shaping media narratives, and suppressing dissent that's viewed as destabilizing or against the national interest, however that's defined at the time.
The analysis we read mentions specific instances of political engineering. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, a really notable example is the formation of the Islami Jamhuri Ittihad, or IGI, back in 1988. This was basically a coalition of political parties allegedly orchestrated, at least in part, by the ISI specifically to counter the Pakistan People's Party, which was led by Benazir Bhutto at the time. There were also allegations of activities like tapping her private phone conversations.
Wow, that sounds like pretty direct interference in the democratic process.
Yeah.
What have been the sort of long-term consequences of this kind of intervention?
The analysis suggests it's had a really damaging, corrosive effect on Pakistan's democratic development. By manipulating the political landscape, the ISI has arguably hindered the growth of strong, stable, democratic institutions, and instead fostered a climate of mistrust and recurring instability.
But it's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? Because earlier, we noted that civilian leaders have also sometimes utilized the ISI for their own ends.
That's absolutely correct. Civilian leaders have, at various times, been complicit, using the ISI either to manage perceived internal threats or sometimes to further their own political agendas. And this, unfortunately, has only served to further legitimize the ISI's domestic role over time, kind of embedding it deeper.
So when we talk about the state within a state, it's not just about their operational independence, is it? It's also about their ability to influence the very definition of what constitutes the national interest and what's deemed a security threat.
Precisely. They operate with considerable autonomy, they lack significant transparency and accountability mechanisms, real ones anyway, and their influence on defining the national interest poses a genuine challenge to democratic governance. You can maybe think of it like a powerful division within a large corporation that, while nominally reporting to the CEO, effectively sets its own agenda and priorities, sometimes conflicting with the overall company direction.
Okay, now let's shift focus slightly and examine their effectiveness in a really crucial area: internal security and counterterrorism. There seem to be two very different narratives playing out here.
Indeed, there are. On one hand, the ISI is often credited, sometimes quite rightly, with successfully disrupting militant networks operating inside Pakistan. But then on the other hand, you have these very serious accusations of them actually supporting certain militant groups, that whole good versus bad jihadi policy we talked about earlier. This kind of contradictory approach, well, it not only breeds international mistrust, but also creates this bizarre internal dynamic where the state's authority is fundamentally undermined by its own selective support of non-state actors.
And these aren't just vague rumors floating around, are they? The allegations seem quite specific.
No, they're often quite specific. The analysis mentions allegations of providing funding, training, and even safe havens or sanctuary to groups that are internationally recognized as terrorist organizations. There are even claims, though harder to substantiate, about the ISI potentially utilizing illicit revenue streams, maybe like profits from the Afghan opium trade, to help finance their operations or their proxies.
But despite these alleged efforts, and whatever genuine counterterrorism work they do, Pakistan has still experienced some absolutely devastating failures on the counterterrorism front within its own borders.
Tragically, yes. The inability to prevent horrific attacks like the one on the Army Public School in Peshawar or the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, these raise very serious questions about their overall effectiveness. A lack of coordination and proper information sharing between different intelligence agencies has also been cited as a contributing factor in some of these major security lapses.
So it's a really conflicting picture, isn't it? They're actively combating some extremist groups while allegedly supporting others, which you have to think ultimately undermines their credibility and their overall effectiveness in truly combating the root causes of terrorism.
Precisely. This duality makes it incredibly difficult to form a clear, consistent picture of their actual efficacy in genuinely tackling the terrorism problem. Okay, let's now turn our attention fully to their external operations, starting with Afghanistan, which, as we know, is a region where they've been incredibly deeply involved for decades.
Operation Cyclone in the 1980s.
Yeah.
That partnership with the CIA, that's a really key historical moment, isn't it? A defining one almost.
Absolutely. The ISI played an absolutely pivotal role in Operation Cyclone, channeling just massive amounts of U.S. and Saudi support to the Afghan Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviet Union. They were deeply involved in training the guerrillas, providing logistics, and significantly influencing the strategies and tactics used during that brutal conflict.
And that had some pretty significant and, well, long-lasting consequences for the entire region, didn't it? Not all of them good.
It did indeed. While it undeniably contributed to the Soviet withdrawal, which was the main goal at the time, it also empowered many of the Mujahideen groups. And some of those very groups would later evolve into the Taliban and other extremist organizations that continue to plague the region today.
Right. And speaking of the Taliban, the ISI's involvement didn't just stop when the Soviets left, did it?
No, certainly not. The analysis clearly points out that the ISI was instrumental in supporting the Taliban's rise to power in the 1990s. This was largely driven by that strategic depth objective we discussed earlier, the aim being to establish a friendly, or at least controllable, pro-Pakistan regime in Kabul.
And then after the U.S.-led intervention in Afghanistan following 9/11, did things change?
While allegations have persisted pretty consistently, actually, of continued ISI support, or at least links, to the Taliban insurgency against NATO forces and the Afghan national government. This, quite understandably, led to significant strains, sometimes outright hostility, in the relationship between the United States and Pakistan over many years.
So this long and incredibly complex history of engagement in Afghanistan has had some really serious repercussions for Pakistan itself, hasn't it? It wasn't just about external influence.
Absolutely. It's definitely contributed to the prolonged instability of Afghanistan, no question. But it also fueled the rise of transnational militant groups and created significant ongoing security challenges for Pakistan, like the emergence and persistence of the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP. It really underscores the potential dangers, the blowback of relying so heavily on proxy groups to achieve strategic objectives. Things can spin out of control.
Okay, let's move across the border now to another major area of external engagement, the Kashmir conflict. This has been such a persistent, painful flashpoint in the region for decades.
It has, yes. And the ISI has been consistently accused by India over many years of actively promoting and sustaining militancy in Indian-administered Kashmir. These accusations include providing various forms of support funding, weapons, training, infiltration routes to numerous separatist and militant groups operating in the region.
Operation Tupac is mentioned in the analysis as a significant ISI strategy in this context. What can you tell us about that?
Right, Operation Tupac. It was reportedly formulated back in the late 1980s, and it was essentially a strategic plan aimed at destabilizing Jammu and Kashmir through a sustained, multifaceted insurgency. The idea was to draw lessons, apparently, from the Afghan jihad model. The intended goals included things like infiltration of militants, subversion of local administrative structures, creating unrest, and ultimately escalating towards a full-scale jihad in an attempt to, well, integrate Kashmir into Pakistan.
And later on, there was Operation Badir. How did that differ?
Yes, in the late 1990s, Operation Badir represented a shift, arguably, towards a more direct military confrontation. The Kargil War of 1999 is seen as the most prominent and overt manifestation of that particular strategy and action, moving beyond just supporting proxies to more direct, albeit initially covert, military involvement.
But ultimately, these operations didn't really achieve their intended objectives, did they? And they came at a tremendous cost, both in human lives and regional stability.
That's absolutely correct. They failed to achieve the primary goal of annexing Kashmir. They also arguably contributed to the radicalization of the insurgency itself, moving it away from its perhaps initially more political roots. They caused immense suffering for the local population caught in the middle and led to repeated cycles of conflict and near-war situations, severely undermining stability in the entire South Asian region. And that shift from covert support towards more direct military action like Kargil significantly increased the risk of a major, potentially catastrophic military confrontation between the two nuclear-armed neighbors.
The analysis we looked at also includes a table that outlines several major covert operations attributed, or at least allegedly linked, to the ISI. It's a pretty extensive and, frankly, quite alarming list.
It is quite a list. Beyond Afghanistan and Kashmir, which are the main theaters, it includes alleged involvement in major events like the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks and the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul. It also mentions reported support, historically at least, for insurgencies in other parts of India, like the Khalistan movement in Punjab and groups in the northeast.
The sheer scope and the alleged boldness of some of these operations are really quite remarkable, aren't they?
They certainly suggest a willingness, perhaps even a culture, within parts of the ISI to undertake high-risk operations, often relying on maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. However, as we've discussed repeatedly, these actions often carry significant risks of blowback and can have profoundly destabilizing consequences for the wider region and for Pakistan itself.
That reported admission by the then DG ISI, Shuja Pasha, to the CIA regarding the possible involvement of former or maybe rogue ISI elements in the training for the Mumbai attacks is particularly concerning, isn't it?
That is a very, very serious point. It raises fundamental questions about the level of command and control within the agency at that time, or perhaps even more worryingly, it could suggest the possibility of a deliberate policy of utilizing such attacks through deniable assets. Either way, whether it's lack of control or deliberate policy, it has profound and deeply negative implications for regional peace and security.
So when we try to step back and assess the overall effectiveness of the ISI and its external intelligence operations, what kind of picture really emerges from the analysis?
Well, the analysis presents a somewhat mixed, maybe even contradictory picture. The renowned success, as one source puts it, in supporting the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets, that was achieved through a massive partnership with the United States and Saudi Arabia. It wasn't a solo effort. The decision to then back the Taliban's rise in 1996 is described as much more equivocal in its long-term outcomes for Pakistan. And the consistent reliance on militant proxies, well, that has often led to negative long-term repercussions, including periods of significant international isolation for Pakistan. In fact, the policy of supporting militants has been described pretty bluntly by one analyst as helping Pakistan alienate almost every country it counts as an ally. So major successes often seem contingent on external alliances, while unilateral actions involving proxies have yielded ambiguous strategic benefits at best and often significant negative externalities. Ultimately, these clandestine methods and the heavy reliance on proxies tend to undermine Pakistan's soft power and hinder the development of stable, long-term diplomatic relationships.
Okay, now let's try to gain a bit more perspective through comparison. How does the ISI stack up against India's primary external intelligence agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, or RAW?
Yeah, comparing the ISI and RAW, it reveals some really interesting contrasts, not just in their operations, but in their mandates, structures, even their historical origins. The ISI, as we discussed, was born out of that perceived immediate national insecurity right after partition, and it historically maintained a broader mandate that often bled into domestic political affairs. RAW, on the other hand, was formed later, after the 1962 war with China exposed India's intelligence gaps, and it has generally maintained a more strictly focused mandate on external intelligence gathering and covert action abroad.
And there's also that fundamental difference in their reporting structures, isn't there? That seems quite key.
Absolutely, it's a critical difference. While the ISI formally reports to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, its incredibly close ties and operational alignment with the Chief of Army Staff mean that the military often exerts significant, if not decisive, influence over its priorities and actions. It's often described as being owned by the COS. In stark contrast, RAW reports directly to the Prime Minister of India. This suggests a much greater degree of civilian oversight and control compared to the ISI. That reporting structure difference fundamentally shapes the ISI's autonomy and means its priorities are often aligned primarily with the military's strategic goals, even if those don't perfectly match the civilian government's broader agenda at any given time.
What about their respective successes and failures? Are there any major comparisons we could draw from the analysis?
Well, the ISI's notable successes often cited include its crucial role, alongside the CIA, in the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and also, from Pakistan's perspective, its efforts in securing the country's nuclear program and hindering India's perceived pursuit of regional dominance. Its failures, however, are significant too, including its inability to prevent major domestic terrorist attacks like the APS massacre and the huge embarrassment of Osama bin Laden being discovered living deep within Pakistan. Raw's major success, the one that really stands out, is widely considered to be its role in the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, a truly transformative event in the subcontinent's history. Both agencies, though, despite their considerable power and resources, have demonstrably struggled to completely prevent major terrorist attacks within their respective countries. It's also worth noting the nature of their successes differs. Bangladesh fundamentally altered the geopolitical map in India's favor, whereas the Afghan success ultimately led to prolonged instability and blowback for Pakistan.
And how does the degree of governmental oversight and influence compare between the two? You touch on reporting lines, but how does it play out in practice?
This really is a critical distinction highlighted in the analysis. The ISI's influence can, at times, seem to surpass that of the civilian government in Pakistan. Its policies and actions are often driven primarily by the military establishment's priorities. In many respects, it functions as a relatively independent actor in the realm of foreign policy and national security. RAW, on the other hand, is generally considered to be much more firmly under the control of the Indian government. That direct reporting line to the Prime Minister usually indicates a greater degree of civilian oversight and makes it far less likely to act independently of established government policy compared to the ISI.
Okay, let's now turn our attention to the ISI's global standing and some of the more controversial, frankly disturbing aspects of its operations, particularly its human rights record.
Right. The ISI definitely holds a significant, though highly controversial, reputation internationally. It's recognized undoubtedly as a central and influential player in South Asian geopolitics. It gained considerable notoriety, both positive in some circles during the Cold War and extremely negative in others, particularly during the Soviet-Afghan War. Over the years, it's actually been ranked among the top intelligence agencies globally by various publications and analysts, sometimes even number one. However, it is also very frequently characterized, especially by critics, as a deep state entity that wields considerable, often unaccountable influence over policy decisions from behind the scenes.
Yeah, that perception of being a deep state must significantly impact how other nations view Pakistan and interact with its government on the global stage, mustn't it?
Oh, it certainly does. It fosters skepticism, sometimes deep skepticism, regarding the actual authority and durability of the civilian government. It can really complicate diplomatic relations, eroding trust, and making genuine international cooperation on sensitive issues much more challenging.
The analysis also details some extremely serious and deeply troubling allegations concerning things like extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances.
It does, and this is a very grim part of the record. Numerous credible international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, for example, as well as various UN experts and special rapporteurs, have documented extensive and persistent allegations against the ISI and other Pakistani security agencies in this regard. Enforced disappearances, in particular, have been described by the UN as a serious and continuing violation of human rights. This tactic has reportedly been used since the 1980s, but increased significantly in the post-9/11 War on Terror era. Thousands of cases have been officially recorded, but the actual number is widely believed to be much higher, with the regions of Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa being disproportionately affected. The victims include a wide range of individuals: activists, journalists, ethnic nationalists, students, and suspected militants. Disturbingly, even the Pakistani judiciary itself has on occasion noted the likely involvement of intelligence agencies in these disappearances. The UN has expressed particular alarm at the unrelenting use of enforced disappearances in Balochistan, and the families of the disappeared, as you can imagine, often endure immense suffering, intimidation, and perpetual uncertainty.
And these disappearances are often linked directly to extrajudicial killings, the so-called kill and dump phenomenon.
Tragically, yes, there are numerous credible reports, documented by human rights groups, of individuals who were forcibly disappeared, later being found dead, often bearing clear signs of torture. This practice is chillingly referred to as kill and dump. The analysis cites the specific case of Hidayat Lohar as one example among many. UN experts have strongly condemned these widespread reports, particularly in Balochistan, and have consistently highlighted the pervasive climate of impunity that surrounds these alleged crimes. There are also widespread, persistent allegations of torture and other forms of ill treatment of detainees held by security forces, including the ISI.
It sounds like, based on these reports, there is a systematic crackdown on dissent and a deeply concerning culture of impunity within certain elements, at least, of the state apparatus.
The analysis does point towards a pattern of targeting journalists, human rights defenders, activists associated with groups like the Balochistan Youth Committee, BYC, and the Passion to Hafuz movement, PTM, as well as political opposition figures, including, more recently, those from the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, PTI. This targeting manifests through arrests, detentions, the application of restrictive laws like sedition charges, and even, controversially, the trial of civilians in military courts. The Pakistan Protection Act of 2014 has also been criticized by rights groups for potentially providing a legal framework that shields security forces from accountability in certain cases. The apparently systematic nature of these abuses, especially in regions like Balochistan, strongly suggests that they may, in some instances, represent not just rogue actions, but potentially reflect unstated or even stated state policy. This, in turn, fundamentally undermines the rule of law and only serves to exacerbate existing conflicts and grievances within the country.
And these serious human rights allegations must inevitably have significant consequences for Pakistan's standing and reputation on the international stage, right?
Absolutely. International condemnation of these alleged abuses definitely tarnishes Pakistan's global image. It can lead to negative diplomatic repercussions, strained relations with key partners, and potentially adverse economic consequences impacting things like foreign aid, trade relationships, preferential statuses, and international investment. The ISI's alleged central role in many of these human rights violations is a significant contributing factor to this negative perception. Furthermore, the even more serious allegations, things like the assassination of dissidents living in foreign countries if substantiated, would represent a dangerous and completely unacceptable transnational projection of coercive state power. Such actions risk severe diplomatic crises and could lead to further international isolation and sanctions.
Okay, finally, let's address those persistent and highly damaging accusations about the ISI's alleged support for militant proxy groups and international terrorism. This seems to be a recurring theme that causes enormous problems.
Yes, these are perhaps the most damaging and enduring controversies that have dogged the ISI for decades. Numerous foreign governments, India, Afghanistan, and the United States most prominently, as well as various international organizations, academic researchers, and investigative journalists, have presented persistent accusations over many years. The groups allegedly supported by the ISI, at various times and to varying degrees, include factions of the Afghan Taliban, the Haqqani network, often seen as closely linked to the ISI, and various anti-India groups, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, Lati, responsible for the Mumbai attacks, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, Jem. Notably, the FBI reportedly stated quite explicitly in a U.S. court back in 2011 that the ISI sponsors the insurgency in Kashmir. Even after 9/11, when Pakistan was ostensibly a key U.S. ally in the war on terror, U.S. officials continued to allege ongoing ties between elements within the ISI and Afghan militant groups fighting coalition forces. There have also been persistent, though often shadowy, allegations of ISI involvement in, or at least benefiting from, the illicit narcotics trade, particularly the trafficking of Afghan opium, potentially as a means of generating off-the-books funding for operations and proxy groups. This overall strategy of utilizing militant proxies has directly led to accusations of state-sponsored terrorism against Pakistan, prompted international scrutiny and sanctions pressure, like from FATF, and resulted in significant blowback for Pakistan's own internal security, as we discussed with the TTP. That infamous good versus bad jihadi policy is widely viewed internationally and increasingly domestically as a fundamentally flawed and ultimately counterproductive approach that has arguably strengthened the overall extremist milieu in the region. The recurrent accusations of ISI involvement in major terror attacks, particularly the 2008 Mumbai attacks, further compound these issues. And it's worth repeating that reported admission by then DG ISI Pasha to the CIA regarding the possible involvement of some ISI retirees or former members in the training for those attacks. Historically, the ISI's alleged support for organizations designated as terrorist groups by the United Nations has repeatedly placed Pakistan in a precarious position with the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, significantly impacting its economy and forcing it into contradictory actions against some of these very groups it was previously accused of supporting.
So the ISI clearly wields immense power within the Pakistani state. Let's explore that nexus with power a bit more, particularly its influence on the actual formulation of foreign policy.
Yes. The ISI is undeniably instrumental, arguably central, in shaping Pakistan's foreign policy, especially in its dealings with its immediate neighbors, India and Afghanistan. Its intelligence assessments, its operational capabilities, its very worldview are integral to the country's security posture and diplomatic strategies in the region. The historical and, according to many sources, ongoing support for groups like the Afghan Taliban, and even at times in the past, elements linked to al-Qaeda, clearly demonstrates this deep influence. Pakistan's policies towards Afghanistan, for instance, have long been driven by that core objective of achieving strategic depth, basically, trying to ensure a pro-Pakistan or at least non-hostile regime in Kabul. The military establishment as a whole, with the ISI as its key intelligence arm, has reportedly embraced the use of Islamic radicalism and militant proxy groups as an asymmetric tool in its long-standing strategic competition with the much larger India. This has led to a situation where foreign policy towards both India and Afghanistan is often viewed and managed primarily through a security military lens. This approach often overshadows or sidelines opportunities for traditional diplomacy, economic cooperation, or people-to-people contact. This securitization of foreign policy, as analysts call it, has arguably hindered regional integration and fostered a persistent climate of mistrust. Furthermore, and this is crucial, the embrace of radical elements for foreign policy objectives has had severe and often unintended domestic consequences for Pakistan, contributing significantly to the radicalization of segments of its own society and fueling devastating internal violence over the years.
What about the ISI's role in really high-level military and strategic decision-making? We were talking about things like war planning, major strategic shifts, even something as critical as the nation's nuclear program.
The ISI is absolutely a key player in both the formulation and the execution of high-level military and strategic policies within Pakistan, and this definitely includes the country's nuclear weapons program. It's often described, sometimes by insiders, as an integral part of the armed forces, and even perhaps more metaphorically as the glue that helps hold the country together, especially during times of crisis. The agency played a crucial, albeit clandestine, role in Pakistan's pursuit of nuclear weapons, particularly after the trauma of the 1971 war and the loss of East Pakistan. Figures like DG ISI Akhtar Abdul Rahman, who we'll discuss more later, were instrumental in ensuring the agency's significant influence in this absolutely critical top secret area. The ISI also plays a significant role today in the security of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, in counterintelligence efforts to protect the program from foreign espionage, and potentially even in past or ongoing procurement activities related to the program. All of this has significantly elevated its status and influence within the overall security establishment. However, and this is a point raised in the analysis, this significant level of influence, particularly when coupled with what is often perceived as limited civilian oversight and a predominantly military-centric worldview, does raise the potential risk of strategic miscalculation. This is a particularly concerning prospect in the context of the highly volatile and nuclearized environment of South Asia, where missteps or escalations driven by flawed intelligence or institutional biases could have truly catastrophic consequences.
Okay, finally, let's look at some of the key individuals who have actually led the ISI, the director generals, and the kind of lasting impact or legacy their tenures have had. These individuals often seem larger than life.
Yes, several director generals have indeed left a very significant and lasting mark on the ISI, shaping its direction, its capabilities, and its role within Pakistan and the wider region. Lieutenant General Akhtar Abdul Rahman, who led the ISI throughout most of the crucial 1980s, 1979-1987, was really the principal architect of its massive support program for the Afghan Mujahideen during Operation Cyclone. He forged a very close and effective working relationship with the CIA and fundamentally transformed the ISI from a relatively modest agency into a powerful, globally recognized intelligence organization. His close personal relationship with President Zia-ul-Haq made him arguably the second most powerful figure in Pakistan at that time, and his influence extended deep into critical areas like the country's nuclear program. His legacy is really one of building unprecedented operational capabilities for the ISI, establishing vast international intelligence networks, and dramatically expanding the agency's influence in both foreign and domestic policy. He essentially made the ISI the dominant force it is often perceived as today.
And then there was Lieutenant General Hamid Gul, who followed Rahman. He's often referred to, sometimes controversially, as the godfather of certain Pakistani geostrategic policies.
That's right. Gul, 1987-1989, continued, and arguably even intensified, the support for the Afghan Mujahideen in the final years of the Soviet occupation. He also played a very central and highly controversial role in domestic politics, most notably in the formation of that Islami Jamhuri Ittihad, IJI coalition, specifically designed to counter Benazir Bhutto's PPP, a role he himself later acknowledged, quite proudly in fact. Critically, he also significantly expanded the ISI's support to Kashmiri militants, starting right around 1989, marking a major escalation in that conflict, and he was consequently viewed as a particularly dangerous and antagonistic figure by India. Interestingly, the analysis notes he apparently advocated for supporting indigenous Kashmiri groups rather than relying too heavily on foreign mercenaries, though the lines often blurred in practice. Later in his career, after leaving the ISI, he became a very vocal proponent of a pan-Islamist foreign policy and adopted a staunchly anti-U.S. stance. His legacy is really characterized by his overtly ideological approach and his willingness to use the ISI as a tool to actively reshape both domestic politics and regional dynamics. His political interference through the IJI had lasting negative consequences for Pakistani democracy, and his aggressive support for militancy in Kashmir significantly escalated tensions with India. He's often seen as someone who actively fostered a more radical Islamist leaning within parts of the Pakistani security establishment.
Moving forward in time, Lieutenant General Ahmad Shuja Pasha's period as DG seems to have been marked by some particularly challenging and high-profile events.
Indeed. Pasha's tenure from 2008 to 2012 was really dominated by intense counterterrorism pressure, a very complex and often deeply strained relationship with the United States, and considerable domestic political turbulence. It was during his leadership, as we mentioned, that the aftermath of the 2008 Mumbai attacks unfolded. His reported, though perhaps partial, admission to the CIA of possible involvement by former or rogue ISI elements in the training for those attacks severely damaged Indo-Pakistani relations. Then, the 2011 U.S. raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, deep inside Pakistan, was a massive international embarrassment and raised extremely difficult questions about either the ISI's basic incompetence or, more darkly, possible complicity. This led to a sharp, almost immediate deterioration in U.S.-Pakistan relations. The Memogate controversy also erupted during his tenure, where he testified about believing in the authenticity of a memo allegedly seeking U.S. help against a feared military coup, which further exacerbated the already tense civil-military relationship in Pakistan. Additionally, his time in office saw continued, persistent accusations of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, particularly targeting Baloch nationalists and other dissidents, as well as the alleged involvement of the agency in the murder of journalist Salim Shahzad, who was investigating ISI links with militants. Pasha's legacy is largely one of managing an incredibly challenging period, often adopting a defensive posture against numerous international accusations, while simultaneously maintaining an assertive role in domestic affairs, as exemplified by the Memagate affair. He constantly strove to balance the growing demands of counterterrorism against the ISI's more traditional strategic objectives, often resulting in deep mistrust from both domestic political actors and key international partners.
And finally, let's touch on Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid. His recent tenure has also been quite noteworthy, particularly in the context of Afghanistan's recent shifts in domestic politics.
Yes, Faiz Hamid's time as DG from 2019 to late 2021 was significantly intertwined with domestic political maneuvering and, crucially, with Pakistan's Afghanistan policy during the Taliban's rapid and unexpected return to power in August 2021. He was widely perceived as being extremely close to the then Prime Minister Imran Khan, and his initial appointment as DG ISI was itself reportedly a source of significant contention between the civilian government and the military leadership. His controversial, very public visit to Kabul immediately after the Taliban takeover, captured on camera making the now infamous remark, "Don't worry, everything will be okay," was seen by many internationally and within Afghanistan as triumphalist. It reinforced the persistent perception of the Taliban as essentially a Pakistani proxy. The visit drew considerable criticism for being overly conspicuous and potentially fueling anti-Pakistan sentiment among Afghans. While the likely aim was to assist the Taliban in forming a somewhat functional government and secure Pakistan's interests, Pakistan's actual influence over the new Taliban regime ultimately proved to be perhaps more limited than anticipated. Domestically, his tenure was marked by significant, widespread allegations of political interference and engineering, and he became a central figure in the escalating power struggle between Imran Khan's PTI government and the military establishment. He was reportedly transferred from his post as DG ISI, partly due to concerns within the military leadership about the increasing politicization of the agency under his command. Following his retirement, General Hamid has faced extremely serious allegations related to the violent May 9th protests following Imran Khan's arrest, as well as charges of land grabbing and misuse of authority. This led to unprecedented court-martial proceedings being initiated against him in August 2024 and his subsequent indictment in December 2024 on serious charges including engaging in political activities while in service, violations of the Official Secrets Act, and misuse of authority. His legacy is therefore complex and deeply intertwined with a period of significant political instability in Pakistan and the dramatic geopolitical shift in Afghanistan. His Kabul visit may have ultimately backfired strategically, and his deep alleged involvement in domestic political machinations led to a significant personal and institutional fallout, starkly highlighting the considerable risk for ISI chiefs who become too overtly entangled in the political arena.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really clear that the ISI's origins, rooted in those early intelligence failures and a profound sense of national insecurity, significantly shaped its military character and its initial intense focus on India. Its evolution saw that surprising early emphasis on domestic intelligence, then a major transformative turning point during the Afghan war against the Soviets, and a subsequent formalization of its internal reach and power. The ISI operates, by most accounts, with considerable autonomy, heavily influences Pakistan's foreign policy, particularly towards India and Afghanistan, and possesses a highly controversial track record in both counterterrorism efforts and its respect for fundamental human rights. And as we've just explored, the individuals who have led the agency, these powerful director generals, have undeniably left distinct and lasting legacies, significantly shaping the ISI's direction, its methods, and its immense, often contested influence over decades.
Exactly. And hopefully, this in depth exploration has provided you, our listener, with the key insights and maybe some of those aha moments you were seeking. Hopefully, it's given you a clearer, perhaps more nuanced understanding of this incredibly powerful and often enigmatic organization without, we hope, overwhelming you with excessive detail or jargon.
The enduring influence of the ISI really does raise some fundamental, perhaps uncomfortable questions. Questions about the delicate, often fraught balance of power within a state, especially one like Pakistan with a history of military dominance. Questions about the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of national security objectives, and about the significant ethical implications of an agency operating largely in the shadows, wielding immense state power. It's worth considering the potential long-term consequences for a nation when an intelligence agency wields such broad authority and the very real persistent challenges inherent in ensuring genuine accountability and transparency in its operations. This is clearly a topic with many, many layers and deep complexities. Further exploration into areas like civil-military relations in Pakistan or the broader comparative history of intelligence agencies around the world could undoubtedly offer even deeper and perhaps more revealing insights.